In this lecture on the foundations of environmental anthropology, Dr. Eduardo Brondizio first highlights the modern era in world history as one of great global acceleration, in which the use of natural resources and economic development have increased exponentially. He traces the history of ideas used to study the relationship between human culture and environmental constraints, starting with cultural ecology and moving through ecological anthropology, political ecology, ethnobiology, and historic and symbolic ecologies. He notes that these and other related theories and approaches all deal with complexity and connectivity, and that the temporal and spatial scope of current change requires new frameworks for understanding. He ends with questions about the Anthropocene and how anthropology and related disciplines are dealing with the epistemological and moral tensions inherent in current challenges facing humans and the environment.
My original plan was to set the stages of today, and I like to use this figure of the Great Acceleration by Will Stephan, to talk about the challenge that we have in terms of understanding human environmental issues today, right? I mean, we live in a hyper-accelerated time, right? So every understanding that we build about a particular place ends up changing as we go, you know, and the tools that we have are not adapted to capture this kind of change and interconnections. And so this is often my sort of starting points to talk of how I'm trying to bring together, you know, the historical legacy of theories in anthropology and other fields to confront and to collaborate with others today. So I put this forward because, you know, of course we are struggling to understand this change today, but imagine to understand the beginning of the Great Acceleration around the 1940s and 50s. And one of the things, what I want to do here is give a historical overview of what we call environmental anthropology today. It's a genealogy. It's never perfect, you know, and someone else will tell in a different way, but it's to offer a framework where you could see how the different pieces evolved and why they evolved, right? The other point that I want to make is that a lot of what we do today in socio-ecological systems, if you will, has deep roots in anthropology. But those roots are invisible, and I hope they become clear today as I work through some concepts and ways of thinking. And also, I think for me, it's a way to reflecting why did we lost that connection of having such a central place in understanding human environmental issues. So when I put this, I basically provide a summary of what Page did so well here. So imagine the 1950s, and the starting point here will be Julian Stuart's theory of cultural change. What Stuart was trying to do at that point, and that's the origin of cultural ecology, which the term itself comes from his work in the 30s, but this book formalized a theory and a methodology that became cultural ecology. Stuart was confronting, and if you read this book, with the same issues that Page was mentioning about. It's still a legacy of social evolutionism, you know, and unilinear thinking about social change, within anthropology including. Right? Others were proposing new theories of linear evolution at that time. You have the over-relativism, in the sense of, I'm putting over-relativism here, in the sense of still a highly descriptive, place-based understanding of culture without sort of, I mean, I'll mention some theories of the time, but without sort of a frame in which to put relativism in relation to a larger comparative agenda, right? You have cultural determinism coming from the American anthropology, and you have still environmental determinism coming from, more broadly, many other fields. And you have the beginning of another unilinear form of evolutionism, which is theories of modernity. So you have Rostow and others in the post-war starting to think about development, and we continue to use those frameworks today. We use them all the time. When you talk about underdevelopment, developed, overdeveloped, we are using a framework developed during that period. And Stuart had in that context an agenda that was both an agenda of thinking about a method in which we could understand human-environmental relationship in a systematic way, to put in his words, but also an alternative to how we see social change. And that is a very important aspect of that period that we tend to disregard. He was confronting with those same issues, as Paige mentioned, and the same issues that we are mentioning today when we talk about poverty. So what he came and why this book was so fundamental was that he offered a systematic methodological approach to understand human-environmental relationship. And one that he tried to move beyond the overarching theories that explain everything to an empirical method that could be used, but is still within a comparative agenda. So what I put here is a framework, in today's words, that you're not going to find in Stuart's book. You're going to find a wonderful narrative of this drawing that I made here. But what he was trying to do is that to understand cultural change, you need to understand how people adapt in their particular context to the environment. And he developed an approach that had, on the one side, what he called the cultural core. Those features of a society that are most relevant to understand how they adapt and relate to the environment. On the other side, he had the environmental constraints. And the key element and the key concept here was the idea of limiting factors, right? And I'll come back to that into today's context of discussion about limiting factors. And in between, he was concerned with the elements of behavior and creativity, which is a word that he used all the time, of how people organize themselves and deal with environmental limitations through technology and through different forms of social organization. So he created a frame in which people could sort of overcome what came before. I mean, the legacy of overarching theories in theories that were I'm not gonna. Paige did a great job covering them to a methodology and an empirical methodology. Well, I mentioned about multilinear evolution, but so what he, in his words, what he was interested on was to move away from that, sort of highly deterministic pathway and look at, how different aspects of different societies and cultures may evolve and may have similarities and may follow some patterns, but not necessarily in any particular sequence. And when you look back into, if you look into the testing of all the social evolutionist types of theories, they could not explain diversity over time or diversity over space. So there was already a pretty strong need for other ways of thinking about how do we explain, how do we understand diversity. So coming back in a very simple way, what he was trying to do was, a general methodology, and I'm trying to put here in very simple terms, right? Describe and analyze the relationships between productive technology and particular environments. Pay attention to that. He was telling you, as you go to a place, pay attention to that. Describe behavioral patterns or elements of social organization that are key to understand how people link to the environment. And understand the relationships of how one particular pattern of social organization influence or response to environmental constraints influence other parts of society. So he said that kind of framework applied to a very localized context. He was interested in understanding the reality on the ground, how people deal with those things, and what can we learn from a comparative perspective if we sort of follow the systematic ways of thinking. So I put more text here, but just to illustrate how in that book he outlines what is not very different today when we think about, sort of training students. So pick your specific question. Don't try to explain everything and try to generalize for everything. Think about your problem. What problem you're interested on. You're going to pay attention to particular issues if you pay attention to those problems. Define what are the relevant issues for us to understand in relation to that problem, both from the environmental side and from the social side. Try to outline what kinds of relationships you see between those elements and so forth. Possible causalities, historical context. And then he had an element, which is, I think, that one of the most interesting components of that and the most disregarded, I think, which was what he called levels of social integration. What he was trying to do at that time was the sketches of a theory of complexity, in which he works a lot with very small units in the Great Plains, with families and with very small band groups. And his idea of levels of social integration was an idea of understanding how individual units, social units, become part of large complex societies. It was a project that I'll come back tomorrow when I talk about my own research, that was largely abandoned for many reasons. The project of understanding complex. And he's not the only one. There are many fronts in anthropology that were between the 50s and the 70s trying to grasp and define a sort of a theory of complexity, which has been sort of put on the background because of many debates within anthropology and other issues. And I may come back to that tomorrow. But here's where you see when he tried to apply his method both at a local level and explain complex societies. And this is another one of the most fascinating, I think, chapters in anthropology that is forgotten. The Peoples of Puerto Rico project. That project was an idea in which, very much we do it today, right? Work as a team. The team has a common goal. We each go to a different site. We collect our work and we come back together to integrate those sites into an understanding of a complex society, in this case, Puerto Rico. So here's the cover of the book. And that book had perhaps one of the most influential generations of anthropologists up to very recently, right? And I sort of put the photo of Sid Means there, who was one of the ethnographers of that period, one of the students and one of the links between the Boasian anthropology and today. He passed away in November. And Sidney Mintz was part of that team. What that team, and here's the first turn that I want you to start to get you to understand of the first two turns that develop on what we call environmental anthropology today, which actually I should have mentioned about the terminology, but I'll get to that at the end. His group, on the one side, were studying societies that were basically colonial societies, right? These were a colonial enterprise of monoculture and control of labor and everything else, right? What Mintz and Eric Wolf and others you start to look at was that the explanation of cultural ecology, the framing of an environment, social organization, technology, was, you could explain some things with it, you could explain localized patterns, but you couldn't capture the role of those external forces that actually shaped the relationship of a particular place. So Stuart was coming, of course, in a place already influenced by a lot of that on the Great Plains, but much less visible, I guess, political economic context, which was not possible to ignore in Puerto Rico. That provides the foundation for the emergence of political ecology and for that turn that starts to happen during the 1960s and takes place during the 1970s. So, there's a major shift here if you're sort of following my logic here. Now, the first big reaction was not political ecology, was what became known as ecological anthropology. And I'll step back here to talk about terminology, because we use environmental anthropology today as a term that is no older than 1994, 93 or so. And it has to do in part with the response of anthropologists work on environmental issues, mainly in the US, to the fragmentation of the field and trying to find an umbrella that was not ecological anthropology, and I'll tell you why, that would be inclusive of the full range of anthropology of the environment taking place. So it was a very strategic move, and it led to the anthropology and environment section of the American Anthropological Association. There are particular individuals that were very important in bringing that conciliatory approach to what I call an umbrella, instead of lines that had particular theoretical orientations. So the term became popular after the 1990s. It's in a way that it's becoming inclusive, right? Now, ecological anthropology is still largely used in many places, and sometimes with the same idea of being inclusive of what we do in terms of human environment in anthropology, right? Human ecology is often used as another label for the inclusiveness of the field and to respect the diversity of the field. In cultural ecology, it's still used in many ways, sort of in an inclusive way, more than what it refers to Stuart's cultural ecology, right? In geography, for instance, geography has a very strong field of cultural ecology. And it has sort of different debates or sort of, a different perspective than when we think about cultural ecology in anthropology. But ecological anthropology was a different turn. And the turn here was not as much a turn, and actually the opposite of a turn to the attention to the political economy, but an actual attention to the ecology. So, and I'll show text right after this. So what you have is that the term ecosystem and the use of the framework of ecosystem start to become a frame to understand and both to bring anthropology to a conversation with biology and with evolutionary theory, and a way of looking into the environment in a more detailed way, to put it simply. Right? So you have, of course, the ecosystem ecology itself from Odum and others being serving as the frame. You have important readings of like Clifford Geertz's book, which is a wonderful book. It's sort of an ecosystem reading of the history of Indonesia. It's a beautiful book, but using the ecosystems as a frame to explain the different types of productions and types of interactions with the environment in that particular region. And you have a paper, which I believe is a chapter, in fact, in which Andrew Vida and Roy Rappaport present an alternative to cultural ecology. And they call ecology cultural and no cultural. I'll get to this in a second. Now, one of the seminal works of that time is Roy Rappaport's Pigs for the Ancestors. It's a beautiful book. It's one of the most, perhaps the most criticized work in anthropology. And he spent his last 20 years, but the next 20 years responding to criticism about anthropology. And I'll get to that in a second on the implications for that. But it's such a beautiful work in which he brings a cultural ecology perspective on the one way, an ecosystem perspective, the sort of systemic thinking about flows of resources and energy and material in nature, in connection with the social and ritual institutions in which society in which that particular Samba group frame and mediate and orient their relationship with, in this case, with the particular, the use of the ecosystem, the vegetation, and the population of pigs and how that enters into their cultural repertoire. I'm not going to get into that, but it's a seminal work which actually did, with all its flaws and advances, what a lot of us try to do today, to bring the symbolic and the religious to the core of understanding relationships with the environment. But that's to another discussion. As I said, he spent the next 20 years just responding to that. Now, here are elements of ecological anthropology. I just put this a little bit in more detail, and then I'll pass more faster to other phases because of the nature of this group. Because what I want to see is, sort of the relationship between the language we use in socio-ecological systems analysis today to that period and to the way those things were framed in that period. So in that paper, they mention ecology rather than cultural ecology, right? Anthropology needs to connect to general ecology. Develop a single science of ecology that applies to humans. So they're really trying to really get into the evolutionary thinking in a way that was inclusive of social systems. Looking into other components that have been ignored, genetics and behavior, or at least framing those questions. And a number of other elements that are there, I'm not going to repeat, where they try to frame the study of societies and cultures from the perspective of an evolutionary and ecosystem-based ecology, right? Including changing the units of analysis, which is a very interesting part of that work of shifting in terms of how you define social units in a way that it aligns with the definitions that are ecological definitions of units. So I'm not going to go into that. What I want to mention is that it brought all those terms from ecosystem ecology and then developed new terms that are central for how we think today about socio-ecological systems analysis and how we frame, in fact, today socio-ecological systems analysis. Of course, systems, ecosystem structures, in a whole variety of languages that relate to adaptation. So that's what I sort of didn't highlight enough, both in cultural ecology and here, adaptation from the perspective of looking at feedbacks is sort of the central core that people try to understand systems and feedbacks and develop the language and the structure to do that. So what you see, I just pick a few examples, is the rise in abuse and misuse and everything else, but also really interesting frames of system thinking and the way in which you could understand those relationships by thinking about it as a system of exchange of energy, material, and information. What that led to is, of course, the beginning of computer systems, system thinking. So it sort of created a frame in which we can understand things as a system, and allowed many kinds of productive engagement, productive interpretations of systems, of agriculture, of all kinds of households, sort of framings in which you could understand pieces and feedbacks and so forth. Now, that led to a number of other problems because of the overuse or the isolation of that kind of system thinking from the political context and the social context in which things happen, right? So Ben Orlov has this wonderful paper, still today, it's very useful to understand all this history, where he highlights the drawbacks of that period. Right, the functional fallacy, the interrelationships of everything as in a closed system. The reductionism, of the ecological reductionism of social processes, right, into exchanges of energy and material and so forth. The overemphasis on energetics. Everything was accounted in terms of calories, right? The local population or the closedness of the system as if independent of everything else that happens or shapes that system. And the time scale, there's usually getting a very synchronic, very limited time scale of how something is functioning in a closed way. There's a lot of that from that period that still informs how we think about those things today. Now, the other element, of course, and I'll have to probably move faster here, is that political economic turn. And Paige will pick up on that and talk about other turns within the political ecology itself. But the basic idea here is that the questions that we're framing and the way of sort of framing the understanding of local populations and adaptation was one that paid attention to the dynamics of external, political, and economic, the dynamics of control of resources, the dynamics of control of access, and a number of other processes in which ownership is transmitted and negotiated, right? And that and institutions arise, and that defines, how populations are organized and respond to environmental issues. So the term political ecology comes from much earlier, in fact, but it's used in the way we use today. A lot of it, refers to the paper that, if you remember now the genealogy, Eric Wolf's frame in a workshop. It's a really interesting paper because it has political ecology in the title and doesn't talk about political ecology at all in the paper. What it talks about is inheritance, ownership, external control of resources, mainly in the Alps, which is a workshop related to that particular period. It's a fascinating little piece. But the whole idea here was that, you had word system theory, strong in the 60s. You had dependence theory emerging. You had basically an attention to put it very quickly, the political economy that shaped people's relationships to the environment. There's another underlying current here that is very important then and today. It has at the same time a parallel development and at the same time an intrinsic development that starts with cultural ecology. And that is ethnobiology, broadly speaking. If you take ethnobotany, you're going to start to see ethnobotany from the end of the 19th century. Ethnobiology starts to be framed as such in the 1950s. And the attention here is on how people think about the environment. In which ways language in the frame, the invisible cognitive frame that we have, shape the way we understand nature. And there are many terms, many turns on this that we do not have time to cover here, on also, how we brought the scientific methodology to interpret how people think and the drawbacks of that. But the basic idea here is, rethinking local knowledge and what people know about the environment in their own terms, and actually unpacking that as a more sophisticated knowledge than we bring to the picture. And here's I bring Harold Conklin, passed away not even 2 weeks ago, right? He was the other linker that shaped the way we think about those things today. So Harold Conklin, seminal work, you can talk a lot about how this, how you bring linguistics to this and, the other historical terms there. But what I'm going to highlight is that important work on shifting cultivation, because I think it brings both that dimension of cognition. It also brings the political dimension of how we understand people and productive systems. In that particular work, what he does is to show the sophistication of shifting cultivation systems, the productiveness of shifting cultivation systems, and the complexity of knowledge that goes into that. It still today provides fuel for us to fight the criminalization of shifting cultivation. It still today provides us the elements to say, the bias that we bring to interpret production systems that do not fit into the modernization terms of what we think as productive systems. But the point here is that you start having, sort of these areas of specializations that start to emerge. Usually, and that's a problem that we can discuss in coming days, as a reaction to what has not been covered before, rather than a complementarity of, we need to look at this too, right? That's another issue. The other reaction starts during the 1980s. There's a lot more in between here. It didn't talk about cultural materialism and other, sort of frames, just because we don't have time. I want to offer a general framework for you to think how all those fields evolved. The other important reaction was what we call today historical ecology, which starts in the 1980s. And the basic tenets here was, I mean, there are many tenets here, but one of the basic tenets here is that the idea that the environment has limiting factors is not valid per se. Human creativity can shape those limiting factors in our favors, and there is not a single place on Earth that we are subjected to that kind of limitation. So it changed the cultural ecology idea of limiting factors as a non-issue, which is another stretch that we can discuss. It put a long-term perspective in understanding human environment and understand the environment itself, and it takes a very much a landscape perspective to look into relationships, not a localized, bounded social group perspective. So to put it very simple, it has been very influential in many ways, in part because it allows us to rethink the ideas of pristinity and the ideas of conservation, in which you see the kind of separation of environments that have not been affected by humans. So it really paved the way for the way we discuss conservation today and the way we discuss the role of indigenous and local communities in conservation today. And many other, there are interesting debates behind all those things that we can elaborate later. Then the other turn, and I'm just sort of putting a piece of it, was actually to rethink the whole thing in a way in which, look and thinking reflexively about our frame of reference as one frame of reference. And even the way we understand what we call the environment, what we call different compartments of the environment, and the separation between humans and non-humans as one particular frame of reference. So it brought, along with other works, I'm just putting some examples that I think speak very recent and speak very, very directly to this group. But it brought a different way in which we think about the so-called cultural nature divide, right? Trying to break those ideas as a construct in itself that can be productive or not, but to put a perspective in which we need to pay attention to the way others think and look about the environment, and that will help us to understand how and why people behave in a particular way, right? Here's one of the papers that I think Paige mentioned before, which is seminal. I mean, this work, it's heavy reading, but Mary Stratton's work with this, I forgot the name of the group, the Hagen. It's a fascinating reading about their blurry of divisions between what is the domestic, what's nature, what's culture, what's nature, and of course the relationship with the way they think about gender and other issues. But the point here is that you have this other reaction of bringing the symbolic into the picture in its own terms, right? Again, mostly as a reaction of previous perspectives. So what we have is, and I think that's the way I look into environmental anthropology is both as trying to be very inclusive about all those perspectives, including the ways people write and the way people think about that, but also being very critical about the avoidance or the sort of the lack of a synthesis, the lack of looking into the interrelations of those pieces. And what is interesting is that we, in one way or another, we are dealing with every piece of the equation, but we haven't managed to put them together yet. And that's interesting because if you look at the efforts of what socio-ecological systems mean, it's a way of putting things together, right? And that has been happening. And I have a slide about it, I guess, has been happening in a very broad and large field in which anthropologists contribute to, but are not central to. And that's the puzzle that gets many of us sort of, and many times irritated or many times sort of frustrated with the ability to look at all those different parts, but the inability of come together and think about the theoretical synthesis or re-engage in that conversation again. So, a lot of that story has been one of, and I use just few terms that I think are very telling of this. Rappaport, he wrote, appendices to his book that are this big, just responding to specific criticisms. But the idea is that he talks about, the rise and demise of knowledge that happens in anthropology. And Eric Wolf, when in actually writing an eulogy of Roy Rappaport, he used this, what I think is a fantastic way of summarizing it. The project of intellectual deforestation that marks a lot of this development, which is in each one of those responses, you sort of try to ignore or erase or actually really undermine the perspectives that were coming before in favor of getting a new force on or getting a new way of looking into that. James Aikson has a wonderful review about anthropology of fishing, very early 1980s, and he talks about these clubs and the debate about the lack of a theoretical umbrella that I think Monique really brought that up earlier. And I would say I think what we have is an arrested project, right? A project in which I read a lot about the history of complexity today, and I'm engaged in a project, in a book about this. You look at the terms that, Stuart, Marvin Harris, a number of other people at that time, they were using terminology and concepts that today you see rewritten in complex system thinking, or rewritten in Giddens' structuration theory. So it's a really interesting genealogy that has been lost over the long term because of many positive and negative ways. One other aspect of it, and we could have a whole other thing just about the methodologies of this whole period, is that the 1980s, you start to confront a situation that none of those approaches were sufficient to deal with. And as it is today, right? I mean, the complex of connectivity, the pace of change, the idea, the force of the global over local, just creates a different kind of problems in which we are very handicapped in terms of methodologies. So we've engaged in a variety of responses to that, and that's beyond anthropology, but many of that. Usually, what you have are narrative frames to capture a particular process, right? So we have, if you look at, mainly relate to globalization. So you look at the end of the 1980s, you have a Padurais frame, which are a number of narrative concepts to try to grasp with the complexity of things. And I could give examples, like a lot of narrative frame examples, that they offer a way of understanding, and then they hit a ceiling because they don't offer actual frame for studying it. And then you hit a ceiling, and then you go to the next term or to the next concept that will help to capture that complexity. Now, in parallel, everyone else is trying to do it in many different ways, right? And what happened is that what you have is the rise of frameworks. And frameworks here become meta-theoretical tools or theoretical perspectives, as some people write. So they are both a media of collaboration, a way of bringing pieces together, a place for a conversation, and a way in which you conceptualize those complexities. Every single one of them have advantages and disadvantages, depending on the problem that you bring. But I'm putting this here in part to say, what we have to offer as anthropologists could be very central to this debate. But ourselves, we have been limited in engaging in a conversation of synthesis that would provide that interface with all these interactions. The Anthropocene debate comes. And I have a paper on this issue coming this week. If it arrives, I'll share with you, which is a revision of the debates of the Anthropocene, and mainly touching on what I think is the most important contribution of this debate, which are the epistemological and moral tensions of it. What happened is that, and the way you can frame it, is these tensions can serve as a way of stimulating conversation and actually deal with the really difficult issues that we haven't been able to deal with, or can be another way of segmentation. It depends how we are responding to it. This paper deals exactly with that issue. It's coming in global environmental change. The value of this is that it has really touched on, the core issues. And it's an opportunity for us to engage on the difference of the core issues to be able to unpack and move forward in a productive way. So to close, remember the idea, this is a keynote that I gave last year called A Cultural Ecology of the Anthropocene. And there was a play with the history and the Anthropocene. But if you think about the Anthropocene debate today, it's a cultural ecology frame at a global scale. Right? So if you think about, the sustainable development goals as the cultural core, right? The planetary boundaries, which is another can of worms to discuss and really interesting concept to discuss, becomes the limiting factors that we're discussing. Now, a much more complicated story in between that we didn't have at that time. But the point that I want to make here is that we are at a turning point where the conversation can go in many ways. It can go into specialization and fragmentation, or whatever way you want to put it. It can go into a different challenge of synthesis that I think is an opportunity that we have.